Sorry guys, picking back up here with evaluating organizational credibility. It's important to also evaluate the organization that's being discussed. So for example, the National Education Association or the American Academy of Pediatrics, those are typically pretty reputable sources, but it's important to keep in mind that organizations also have biases and worldviews, and that some of them are pretty specific about an ideology that they promote. So you want to ask yourself questions about the information that they provide, the references for their research, who their professional staff is, who they're hiring and who's writing for them, whether they have a mission statement. Some organizations are, very heavily for the environment, and they're really pushing an environmental agenda. Others are, anti-vaccine organizations or, politically motivated in some way. So it's important to sort of weed out credible organizations from organizations that may be less credible because of their bias, because of their ideology. We talked in an earlier chapter about how authors sometimes make assumptions in their text, and so at this point you should be pretty familiar with identifying those assumptions, but it is worth noting that assumptions can be either warranted or unwarranted. Warranted assumptions are assumptions that are likely to be true because of the evidence that would support it. So, if you were to assume that the critical analysis was going to be a big part of your grade, that would be a warranted assumption. There's probably some evidence to support that. Even though I maybe haven't told you that explicitly, it's an assumption on your part if you don't know exactly how many points it is. But you can guess based on the fact that it's the longest paper, it's the most complicated one, we have the most amount of time to work on it, we've been building up to it all semester. I've described it as a capstone assignment. Those are all evidence or clues that would support your assumption. So that would be a warranted assumption. An unwarranted assumption might be something that really doesn't have any evidence to support it, though. So you might say, well, I'm going to assume that, I assume I'll do fine on this paper. I'm not really going to study or spend a lot of time on it, right? That might be an assumption, an unwarranted assumption, if you have no evidence to support that you will do well. Maybe you do have a lot of evidence to support that. Maybe you've been doing well so far. Maybe you're a good writer. Maybe you've gotten good feedback. So then that would be a warranted assumption. But if you don't have that evidence, then it would be an unwarranted assumption. So those are just a couple of examples of assumptions. We're getting ready to launch into a particularly complicated part of this chapter, so I'm going to do my best to explain it, but it's usually easier when I'm doing it face-to-face with students in a classroom, and I can give examples and they can ask questions. So this is going to be a little tricky. I'm a little nervous about going through this, but I'm going to do my best. So when we're talking about deductive logic and deductive arguments, we are talking about an argument with three distinct parts. Premise A, premise B, and a conclusion. So these are typically written in if and then statements, like the first one on your screen here. If premise A and premise B, then there's a conclusion, right? So there are lots and lots of ways that this type of argument shows up in our daily life. We'll talk about some examples in a minute, but eventually you'll need to evaluate arguments like this. And you're going to ask yourself three different questions. First of all, is the logic valid? The logic has to do with the structure of the argument, right? Like, would this argument make sense and hold together if the premises were true? Then the second question you're going to ask yourself is, are the premises true? And they may be true or they may not be true, or one of them may be true and one of them is not true. That's a separate question than asking about the logic. And then finally, if you've determined that the logic is valid and the premises are true, then you can determine that the argument itself is sound. But if the logic is not valid or the premises are not true, then that means this is not a sound argument. So we'll talk more about each one of these components. The first one is about the logic, right? When you're evaluating for validity, you have to ignore those other two questions, okay? I'm not asking you if the premises are true right now. I'm just asking, does this logic hold together if those premises were true? So here's an example. If all dogs will always bark when someone is at the door, and the dog is not barking, then the conclusion is that no one is at the door. So we're asking ourselves, is this valid logic? So the answer here is yes, this is valid logic, because if premise A is true and premise B is true, then the conclusion would be true. So that's the logic of this argument. And we'll talk in a minute about what it looks like when logic is not valid. But we're going to move on to the premises. The first question is the same if-then argument. The question now is, are the premises true? So we're asking about premise A and premise B, and we have to ask ourselves, are both of these true premises? So the answer, obviously, is no, because all dogs do not always bark when someone is at the door. It is theoretically possible that you could have a dog that doesn't bark. So premise A is not true, which essentially means that this argument, while the logic is valid, the premises are not true. So when we move on to asking the question about the whole argument, is the argument sound, then we have to determine, no, this is not a sound argument, because although the logic is valid, the premises are not true. So in order for something to be sound, in order for an argument, to be sound, it has to be both valid and true. If the argument fails at either one of those metrics, if it is valid but not true, or true but not valid, then it is not sound. It is not a sound argument. So let's look at some examples. I'm going to just move the screen a little bit so that you guys can't see the answers right away. The first one, Sue is a college student. All college students have cell phones. Sue has a cell phone. This is valid because if those premises were true, then the conclusion would be true. If Sue is a college student, and if all college students do have cell phones, then we could reasonably conclude that Sue has a cell phone. So that is valid logic. But the premises are not true. It is not true that all college students have cell phones. We can't make that definitive statement. So therefore, the overall soundness of the argument is not there. This is not a sound argument because it is valid, but it's not true. In example 2, we've changed things up just a little bit. We're saying Sue has a cell phone, and we're saying that all college students have cell phones, and the conclusion then is that Sue is a college student. But unfortunately, this too is not a sound argument because it's 1, not valid, and 2, not true. The validity has to do with the argument that Sue has a cell phone, and just because she has a cell phone and all college students have cell phones, that does not mean that she is a college student. This premise doesn't say anything at all about other people who might also have cell phones. Sue could theoretically have a cell phone and be any number of people who's not a college student. So there's no guarantee that she is a college student just because she has a cell phone. It's also not true, right? The premise here is not true. again, all college students do not have cell phones. That's not a guarantee. So this one is not valid, not true, and not sound. Example 3, Sue has a cell phone. Only college students have cell phones. Therefore, Sue is a college student. So the logic of this is valid. If Sue has a cell phone, and if only college students have cell phones, then that does mean that Sue is a college student. But it's not a true premise. Only college students have cell phones is not a true statement. So this example is valid, but not true. Therefore, it is not sound. This is not a sound argument. Example 4. Sue is a college student. Only college students have cell phones. Therefore, Sue has a cell phone. You may be tempted to say that this is valid logic, but think about it. Just because Sue is a college student and only college students have cell phones, we have not stated here that all college students have cell phones. All we're saying here is that people who are not college students cannot have cell phones. So this is not valid logic. It's also obviously not a true premise. So this is overall not a sound argument. Finally, example 5, Sue is a college student. College students may have phones on campus. Therefore, the conclusion that Sue may have her cell phone on campus is a valid conclusion. So the logic is valid. These two things are both true premises. So this is the only example out of all 5 that is sound. So take a little bit of time and look over these examples along with the examples in your book. I'm going to come back and do a third video based on logical fallacies, but this is the end of part 2 of Evaluation, Chapter 7.